Hello and welcome to today's webinar on choosing a DNA test for family history research. My name is Ginevra Morse. I am the Director of Education and Online Programs here at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and I will be moderating today's event. NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are very pleased to offer this webinar today for our members and friends around the world. And giving today's presentation is Christopher Child, Senior Genealogist of the Newbury Street Press and editor of the Mayflower Descendant. Chris also edits the Genetics and Genealogy column for American Ancestors magazine and is author of the Portable Genealogist Using DNA in Genealogy. His areas of expertise include Southern New England, especially Connecticut, New York, ancestry of notable figures, especially presidents, genetics and genealogy, African American and Native American genealogy, 19th and 20th century research, westward migrations out of New England, and applying to hereditary societies. So today, Chris will go over what types of genetic tests are available to family historians, what genealogical problems they can and can't assist you with, and ultimately how to choose the right test or tests, plural, to further your family history research. He'll also provide a comparison between some major testing companies and how results can be shared between them. He'll wrap up with a case study on how DNA helped solve a genealogical mystery in his own family. And then finally, you'll have a chance to test your knowledge with two theoretical situations. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to write a question in the panel to the right of your screen. Chris will answer as many as he can in the time provided. There is no handout for today's presentation, but you can take screen captures by using the camera icon in the upper right hand of your screen. That icon won't appear if you're viewing this full screen, so you may just need to resize that open window. But we are also recording this event, and starting tomorrow, you can easily go back and review any of the content from the presentation. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Chris.
Okay, thanks, Ginevra. Welcome, everyone. So what I'll do today is I'll go over the types of tests that are available and how this may factor in how you may choose the most appropriate tests. What tests are actually available now may indeed change over time, and certain trends in DNA testing have changed significantly in the last 10 years. While mitochondrial DNA and Y-DNA testing, which I will discuss, are the earliest types of tests that were available, since currently only one major company in the US still provides these tests, a lot of this talk will discuss the autosomal tests and the differences between the three major companies. I'll start by going over some basic principles of how we obtain DNA which contain hereditary material. Certain types of markers are used by the DNA companies for comparison between other participants and total population groups. While your own DNA is not going to change, how your DNA could be interpreted may change with additional technology. And all of the companies are only as good as the number of their participants. More will join and have joined over time. So perhaps you may not get the match you were looking for today, but you may get a match that might mean a lot in a few years. So I want to emphasize that I think DNA is a very important tool in genealogical research, but it's certainly not the only tool. DNA is not going to tell you everything, and even sometimes what DNA companies tell you should not necessarily be taken all that seriously. Based on the tests that currently exist, DNA is great for corroborating or disproving some genealogical hypotheses, and these are not going to be applicable in every situation, and DNA alone will not solve a brick wall ancestor. DNA will not determine, say, a Native American tribe beyond certain broad geographical parameters in particular situations, and if DNA alone will not be proof positive of a suspected distant kinship. However, autosomal DNA has made determining recent non-paternity events or unknown parentages much more likely to be determined because so many people are testing. On the same end, the likelihood that you may discover unknown close relatives or discover something more recent in your family tree disagrees with your genetic tree is also more likely. Thus, DNA can sometimes open up a can of worms, and this can might be something you may have wanted open or something you might have rather preferred to have closed. While there are many things a single DNA test might indicate, often when reaching specific genealogical conclusions that are aided by DNA, more than one test might be required with multiple companies. And often additional people beyond yourself will be necessary. In many situations, when dealing with a specific genealogical hypothesis, your DNA may not be relevant at all. So the first two types of DNA tests that are genealogically useful that I will discuss are mitochondrial DNA and Y-DNA tests. Now, mitochondrial DNA test, which is our oldest type of test that we've been able to use in genetics and genealogy, is inherited from mother to child. Males inherit mitochondrial DNA from their mothers, but do not pass it on to their children. And the term that I'll be using that is generally used in genealogy to describe this type of gender-linked inheritance is called your matrilineal line. So on this chart here, the four people in red on the bottom generation all carry the mitochondrial DNA of their matrilineal grandmother, who in turn would have had her mitochondrial DNA from her matrilineal ancestors. Now, how mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, has been used in genealogy is when researching one's matrilineal ancestry and comparing if two people could be matrilineally related. mtDNA is not part of our nuclear DNA. It's cytoplasm outside of our 23 chromosomes, so it's sometimes called junk DNA. That's a bit of a misnomer, as there is definitely genetically inherited mitochondrial diseases and whatnot. The main thing to know is that mtDNA is separate from our other DNA chromosomes, and because it's only inherited from the mother, it has a very gender-linked pattern of inheritance through females only. Also, mtDNA mutates at a fairly slow pace, so if one is doing a very specific matrilineal study, sometimes the full sequence mtDNA test may be needed. However, if you're taking this type of test just for curiosity, your basic mtDNA test will do. While other companies had offered this test before, the only company that offers this test currently on a large scale in the United States is Family Tree DNA. When you do take a test, you'll be provided matches with the relevant contact information and who they choose to list as their most recent common matrilineal ancestor. You very well may get matches that you might not be able to determine your kinship genealogically. However, if you do have a specific theory to test, this can be very helpful. I recently tested a theory on the parents of someone who was born in the 1780s. We had two possible sets of parents in mind, and we traced matrilineal descendants of the test of the initial woman and then her two possible mothers, and her mtDNA matched one and not the other. The other bit of DNA testing that is genealogically useful here is the Y-DNA. As men, in terms of our sex chromosomes, are XY and women are XX, this is a type of DNA test that only men can take. Due to the nature of how a male receives their Y chromosome only from their father, who received it only from his father, it creates a very useful gender-specific pattern of inheritance. Females, of course, cannot be tested as they are XX and do not have the Y chromosome. And the term that is generally going to be used in genealogy to describe this line of gender-linked inheritance is called your patrilineal line. Now, Y chromosome tests are best for researching your patrilineal ancestry, one-name study projects, and often sort of comparing immigrants to the New World, say if you think there's a set of brothers that immigrated or cousins. In my own patrilineal ancestry, which is fairly documented 2 generations beyond the immigrant who came to Massachusetts, I descend from Benjamin Child, who came to Massachusetts in the 1640s, along with 3 other first cousins. In our case, I've taken my Y-DNA, and descendants of those cousins have had their Y-DNA tests, and we have all matched Also, we have helped other people who have had brick wall ancestors that are, say, stuck in New York in the mid-1800s. By knowing that they are related to our child family, this has helped them and us focus our research on their family, and in many cases we have figured out how their patrilineal line works. It wasn't solved through DNA, but it gave us sort of a roadmap of where we might look. I'd also like to point out, and you can see here, these are my matches, and my initial matches were all people with the surname Child. When you shouldn't necessarily jump to conclusions when you get your results back and immediately think you're not related to the rest of your family, although that could be a possibility. When I started doing this, I took DNA testing with an 8th cousin named Kelly Child, and him and I initially didn't show up as a match. Then I got a more distant cousin who participated, and he showed up as a match to me, but not initially to Kelly. And what we then did was we got a sort of in-between cousin, someone who was that had about an equal level of kinship to Kelly and myself. And ultimately what we did discover is that he, in this case, Kelly Child, had a very rapidly mutating DNA sequence. So we were patrilineally related, but the initial test results would have indicated potentially that we weren't related. How these mutations happen and how often they happen are averages. They're always going to be aberrations where one's DNA mutates faster or slower. In this cousin's case, probably 2 or 3 markers mutated a few generations where we split with him, and then his closer cousin, once they split, another several markers mutated as well. So perhaps we had markers that mutated at a slightly slower rate. The next DNA test, and this type is relatively new in comparison to the other 2 tests, although it is now over 11 years old, is autosomal testing. While Y-DNA is restricted to men and mitochondrial DNA can be done by both but follows the matrilineal line, an autosomal test can be taken by anyone and will contain genetic material from all sides of your family, regardless of their genders. The 3 major companies that offer autosomal testing are Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, and Family TreeDNA. And more recently, MyHeritage has also started to have their own autosomal test. So each human cell has 23 chromosomes split from the mother's and father's cell, with 1 being our sex chromosome pairing and the remaining 22 being our autosomes. However, each of the 22 pairs of autosomes involves a pairing of 2 parents' DNA, which in turn was paired from their parents' DNA. So while we are going to be 50% our father and 50% our mother, we will not necessarily be 25% each of our grandparents. It could be in some range of 23 and 27% or something like that. However, since what does get paired is so diverse in each autosome, it will take several generations before we lose genetic fingerprints of some of our ancestors. And over time, we may be genetically more related to some ancestors than others. So to demonstrate the randomness of how we can be more related or less related to ancestors, and this will really come into play when you're looking at your DNA relatives, this slide shows how my daughter is related to her 4 grandparents. You can see that she is roughly 50% each of her parents, but she is 26.2% of her maternal grandmother, 25.9% her paternal grandfather, 23.9% her paternal grandmother, and 23.8% her maternal grandfather. Essentially, the partner of the most related grandparent will be the least related grandparent, while the partner of the second most related grandparent will be the second least related grandparent, as both partner genetic contributions to a grandchild will add up to roughly 50%. While this variation is only within 2.4 percentage points, my mother-in-law was very happy to be the most related grandparent to her grandchild. Now, this can be best for comparing close cousins as well as ancient origins. So if a parent of someone provides a sample as well, these tests can also determine which parts of the chromosome were inherited from which parent. You will also likely get very distant genetic cousins as well that you don't necessarily most of the time have to pay that much attention to. In seeing how much DNA you share with your relatives, the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, known as ISOG, has made a very handy tables of autosomal statistics. This also helps explain why siblings will also have different ethnic results, as I'll go into later. On average, siblings are about 50% related, half siblings about 25%, first cousins about an eighth, and so forth. Essentially, each subsequent generation does not just get divided in half, it reduces by another 25%, as each person in the next generation has another parent that contributed genetic material. Now, sometimes you may have identified an incorrect descendant. In one case, a family traced descendants of 17th century immigrants, several reported sons, and this is involving a Y-DNA case. Descendants of the alleged son took this Y-DNA test and did not match descendants of the other sons, and so the administrator simply assumed there must be some non-paternity event in their line. As I looked at the genealogical research, I realized there was good reason to question why this alleged youngest son belonged to the family at all. Turn of the century genealogies and even more recent ones will have mistakes, and not everything when it comes to DNA is going to be a non-paternity event or a misattributed parentage. Also, when evaluating your autosomal results, keep in mind that after parents and siblings, most other predicted kinships, as stated by the companies, will be one of a few possible kinships. So this is an example here. This is a match with Philip, and he gets this match named Esther, and Esther is predicted to be Philip's first cousin. Philip, who's born in 1980, considers this impossible since his two parents were only children, and Esther is roughly the same age as Philip's parents. However, first cousins have around the same DNA in common as that of half-uncles, half-aunts with their half-nephews, half-nieces. It became very clear upon looking at these results and a few other things that this person, Esther, was actually Philip's father's unknown half-sister. Esther actually happened to be from the same town as Philip's father and was actually a biological daughter of Philip's paternal grandfather, Ernest, and an unknown half-sister of Philip's father, Herbert, which was sort of quite a surprise to everyone. Now, many people take a DNA test as an impulse buy, but if you have something specific, it's always a good idea to define your goals in choosing the right test and company. Now, an autosomal test will be your best bet if you just want a basic summary of your ethnic origins, keeping in mind that this can be speculative. Autosomal tests are most appropriate for connecting with genetic cousins, close or remote, and can greatly aid in uncovering recent biological cousins in separations such as adoption. Y-DNA tests are useful in confirming the paternity of a male ancestor over several generations, and mitochondrial DNA tests for confirming the maternity of a female ancestor. And in either of these last two cases, if this is within 5 generations or so, an autosomal test could be applied as well. And while not the focus of this webinar so much, but something that is also available within these tests, if you are interested in learning health predispositions, 23andMe also offers that. And this might be a reason several of your genetic matches may have also chosen to take a DNA test. I'll now go through the major testing companies and how their results are similar and different. The 3 testing companies that I will discuss are Ancestry, 23andMe, and Family TreeDNA. I will touch on MyHeritage DNA briefly, but that company is relatively new to the game of DNA, being only around a year. There were also other testing companies such as National Geographic out there that have less participants, and that does not mean the results you would get from them are incorrect, but often you have less people to compare to, or the company may target towards a specific geographical audience, or have a different target in mind. Oxford Ancestors, for example, has more people tested in the UK, and WeGene caters towards people in East Asia. Still, for other companies that are emerging, I would recommend reading reviews before deciding to go with a smaller scale company. By and large, I recommend these big three, especially for research in the United States, at this point based on testing and participation. So this table outlines some of the differences between the companies. Generally, the tests are normally $99, and you will often find many of them on sale. 23andMe is the only company that also offers health analysis, which is available for a total price of $199, which will also include the Ancestry. However, the Ancestry-only test with 23andMe is also available for the similar price of $99. Well, 23andMe is the oldest of these companies to offer autosomal testing. They are currently in second place for the number of participants with roughly 2 million, which Ancestry, thanks to much of their effective marketing, has now doubled them with roughly 4 million participants. Family TreeDNA has roughly 500,000 participants for their Family Finder autosomal test. There are going to be some differences in the above chart that are worth pointing out. Both Ancestry DNA and 23andMe offer saliva tests. 23andMe, for an additional fee, does have what I call a child sponge collection kit that assists in getting DNA from a non-spitter. This is the type of test I used for my daughter when she was a few months old. Although this is still essentially a saliva test, you're just putting a sponge into the inner cheek. I have found sometimes getting an older relative to produce the required amount of spit can be quite difficult. Family TreeDNA and also MyHeritage, which is not on this table, are cheek swab tests, so this might be considered for benefit of non-spitters. All DNA companies allow you to download your raw DNA, which I'll get into a bit later, as well as searches by surname. All allow you to have family trees, although 23andMe's trees are handled through MyHeritage. Ancestry is able to determine linked tree matches if two participants have ancestors in common, while Family TreeDNA only has linked relationships when the user identifies and enters in the connection. All companies do test the X chromosome, however, X matches are not viewable on Ancestry DNA and only when raw DNA is uploaded onto other sites such as Gedmatch. And the xDNA is not the same as mitochondrial DNA and has some limited genealogical usefulness, but that's for another talk. Another difference is the testing of Y-DNA and mtDNA haplogroups, which I won't really be getting into in this talk. These are the ultimate migration patterns of your patrilineal and matrilineal line. A man will get these both from 23andMe tests, and a woman will get her mtDNA haplogroup. Family TreeDNA won't tell you this with your autosomal test. However, they will tell you this with their more refined Y-DNA and mtDNA tests, for which the same sample could be processed. Now, some other companies may promise you even more detailed results, and I have even seen a company that does claim to identify Native American tribes. I would emphatically say buyer beware. Please read reviews about these companies before thinking they might solve your questions. Again, DNA is not the only piece of evidence in our genealogical research, and if a test sounds too good to be true, consider that it might. Now I'm going to go over the ethnicity reports of the major companies. Now, I know that Ancestry's commercial about trading in the lederhosen for a kilt is popular, but I really want to stress that ethnic results within a continent should be taken with caution, and most of the time, do not consider changing course in your research based on these results. They will vary from company to company and can change as the company's determinations of what is considered an ethnic group change. Their results for within an overall continent, I believe, are more valuable, but even those will have some variation. So my example for all of these displays will be my mother's first cousin Ed, who is the subject of our later case study, since Ed has taken tests with all of these companies. It is essentially 100% European, so later I will show some examples for people with ancestors in other continents as well. His results for family TreeDNA have him as 95% European, 2% Central Asian, and trace amounts of West Middle East and Sephardic Jewish. The company states that trace amounts may be attributable for other reasons. Within Europe, FTDNA has only specific country identified here is Finland, while the other places are somewhat broad: British Isles, Scandinavia, Southeast, West, and Central Europe, and Iberian. Now, here are his 23andMe ethnicity results, and while the continental origins are similar, right away we see some differences. FTDNA had Ed as 88% British Isles, while here Ed is 69.2% British and Irish and 11% French and Germany. These European groups migrated within the continent, which will explain the differences between the companies. And their sort of definitions of how they consider a group are different. They're based a lot of times on testing populations that live there today and then testing remains of people that had lived there in the past. And that has a lot of assumptions tied to it. You can also view your ethnic origins on 23andMe along 5 different levels of 50% confidence, which is listed as speculative, to 90% confidence, which is listed as conservative. Ancestry's DNA test gets perhaps the most specific, as they even claim to separate Ireland from Great Britain. Here Ed is 35% Irish, 17% Great British, 23% Western European, and 13% Scandinavian. I should also point out, as far as I know, Ed has no recent Scandinavian ancestry, and this will include the ancestry behind his surprise that I will get into later. However, one well-known historical occurrence to consider is with the Normans who conquered England were descendants of Scandinavians that lived in Normandy, France. All of this, again, accounts for the considerable variation. Also, with their new feature on Ancestry called Genetic Communities, they are indicating areas within the United States his ancestors may have lived. MyHeritage was actually the least variant, and he was about equal parts North and West European and then English. Now, this was the only company that listed English versus British Isles. Their test actually separated English and then lumps Irish, Scottish, and Welsh together into another category. Now, again, as if I did not say this enough already, please be cautious with these results. Since these tests are so low in price, this really is an impulse buy, but the benefits, in my opinion, are greater when looking at closer DNA cousins. In terms of how the ethnicity data is reported, my own preference begins with 23andMe, then Family Tree DNA, and then Ancestry. That order is my own opinion, and there are other blogs out there that might rank this a bit differently. Also, to show an example of multi-continental ancestry and the differences between companies. So here are the examples, the results of my wife, whose parents are from the Dominican Republic. MyHeritage DNA has her at 51.1% European, 23.9% African, 15.5% Native American, and 9.5% Middle Eastern. While her results from 23andMe have her at 66.2% European, 19.9% African, 9.4% Native American, and 1.7% Middle Eastern. The greatest differences are that she is considerably less European and much more Middle Eastern with MyHeritage, so even ethnic estimates within different continents are going to vary by company. Also, siblings who I mentioned earlier are on average only 50% related will also have different results. Here are the MyHeritage results between my mother Claudia and her brother Juan. Juan shows up as 61% European, while Claudia is 51.9%. They have a similar amount of African DNA, and their Native American DNA is within 3 percentage points. However, Claudia is listed as 4.1% Middle Eastern, while Juan is listed as 0. None of this should be really surprising to see varying results between siblings. The only people with identical DNA will be identical twins. I'll now go through DNA matches and how the appearances vary by company using Ed as our example. For Family Tree DNA, Ed has 785 matches. These provide the relationship range, the number of shared centimorgans, whether it is an X chromosome match, and whether it's a linked relationship. You are also usually provided an email, a family tree if the match provided one, as well as a list of surnames if they provided them. For 23andMe, Ed had 1,242 matches, which have the names, predicted kinship, and percentage of DNA shared with more options after clicking on each match. You can contact your matches here through 23 message system and share your email with them if you wish. On Ancestry DNA, Ed has 595 matches. The matches give the predicted kinship their confidence level and whether they have an open or closed tree with options upon clicking the match, such as who has shared relatives, which is a feature also offered by 23andMe and mtDNA. Like 23andMe, you can contact you can contact any of your matches through Ancestry DNA and also provide your email with them if you wish. And just to sort of quickly show you with MyHeritage DNA, at this point, Ed has 90 matches. The results are here displayed, showing the same strength of kinship and a linked tree if that is provided. Now, some of the companies also allow us to do additional features by chromosome. Family TreeDNA has a feature called Chromosome Browser, which allows you to pick different matches and see where along each chromosome your shared DNA is, and also if your matches are related to each other. I think this is a very useful option that helps you visualize your match and see the various segments you share and how long or short they are. 23andMe has a similar feature called Share and Compare, where you can compare up to 5 people that you are sharing with, and you can see sort of bit by bit along each chromosome which segments you share. And again, this is very useful, I think, for visualization. Also, you can see if any of your sharing connections share DNA with each other, even if they do not share DNA with you. Now, Ancestry does not have a chromosome browsing feature. The extent to seeing the strength of your match involves clicking each match, then going to their confidence level, scrolling your mouse over to their blue eye, and then that will show you the amount of shared DNA and along how many segments, not the lengths of each segment. However, if you do want to visualize your match, this is possible and involves uploading your raw DNA onto Gedmatch. So the example before with Ancestry DNA involved Ed and his second cousin, Mike. Since both kits have also been uploaded onto Gedmatch, I can see now here the longest block of DNA shared plus chromosome by chromosome, the shared segments. This may be a little more technical, but I do think it's useful so that you can really see for yourself what DNA companies are purporting to tell you. Now, if you have taken an autosomal test with just one company, there are some options to see if you can compare with participants who have tested with other companies. Gedmatch is a free third-party site which allows you to upload your raw DNA for cross-comparison. And currently, MyHeritage and Family TreeDNA also allow you to upload your raw DNA onto their site for free if you have tested with another company. So specifically to Gedmatch, this has a lot of innovative features for sharing between, sharing and comparing between people who have chosen to do so. You can upload if you have tested with Ancestry, 23andMe, mtDNA, MyHeritage, and also WeGene, which has a larger East Asian market that I had mentioned earlier. Once you upload your DNA, you'll be assigned a Gedmatch number. This number, if you provide it to anyone, can actually essentially be used by them for any type of matching within Gedmatch. There have even been articles in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly that cite a person's Gedmatch number when discussing genealogical conclusions that have a genetic component. And this wonderful graphic highlights the chain of sort of how you can upload between the various commercial autosomal companies and then onto Gedmatch. Basically, if you tested with either 23andMe and Ancestry, you can upload your DNA onto the two other companies and Gedmatch. But currently, you would need to take a separate test with both 23andMe and Ancestry to see your matches within each company. Also, while you can upload your raw DNA onto Family Tree DNA for free, you need to pay an additional $19 to see your ethnic origins and some other features. Also, while mtDNA is the only one of these companies that does offer Y-DNA and mtDNA testing, you would need to provide another sample if you wanted to have those DNA tests with mtDNA and had your raw DNA uploaded from another company. Although the sample from mtDNA can be used for all of the different products they offer if you tested with them initially. So if you are a true DNA junkie and wanted all tests available from the ones described above, this would be 2 saliva tests from 23andMe and Ancestry, and then 1 cheek swab test from mtDNA. But if you are only interested in autosomal DNA, you could just take tests from Ancestry and 23andMe and compare to everything else here. Now I'll go through another unique feature of 23andMe and Ancestry. I had shown ethnic reports for my wife in an earlier slide. One additional feature that 23andMe offers is the way to see the chromosome view of your ethnic estimates. This is a neat way to visualize your ethnic results. The top half of one chromosome is derived from one parent and the bottom half from the other. This won't tell you which parent, and the chromosome itself can change between parents. But what this tells me, and even if I did not have my wife's parents take tests, is that both of her parents have some levels of European, Sub-Saharan African, and Native American ancestry. And I've also seen this be very handy if someone has one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent. It can highlight the differences along this chromosome ethnic viewer. Ancestry has features called DNA circles and genetic communities. DNA circles scroll through your matches trees online to determine the confidence that you might descend from a given ancestor. Because more people are genealogically inclined to have trees online with Ancestry, currently if you were to take only one test and did this for genealogical reasons, I would recommend Ancestry as the best likelihood of having valuable genealogical results, followed by 23andMe, although several people who have tested with 23andMe, and this can be true for other companies as well, may not have taken this test for genealogical reasons. Many people test with 23andMe for their health reports, and so again, for all of these, do not be surprised if you do not hear from a DNA relative. Ancestry may not have been the reason they have taken this test. And on Ancestry DNA, genetic communities is a new thing, and it's taking the ancestry of trees and now providing the likelihood of, say, where within the United States your ancestors may have lived. This is new, and it'll be interesting to see how this pans out. So I'll now go through an interesting case study that involved all of these tests across several companies. So this story involves my mother's first cousin, Ed Horton. You've seen all of his DNA reports. He's the son of my maternal grandmother's brother. My initial goal in this case was to do a Y-DNA study on our Horton ancestors to see if they were related further back to other Horton families. Ed and his younger brother Vernon were my closest cousins that should have the Horton Y-DNA, so I asked Ed, since I talked to him a lot about genealogy, to take a test. He also decided to take some autosomal tests, including 23andMe, since myself, my mother, and uncle had already tested with them. Now, his results from Family Tree DNA took a while, but he got his 23andMe results fairly quickly. His results confused him considerably as he shared no DNA with my mother and uncle and only had matches to people he did not know. There was at least one result of someone relatively closely related to his mother. I recommended that his younger brother Vernon take a test as well and see what those results may say. So we got Vernon's results, and this was quite a considerable surprise. Vernon was shown to be a first cousin to my mother and uncle, but a half-brother to Ed. Vernon and Ed had the same mitochondrial DNA, but different Y DNA, which means that they had the same mother and different fathers. We were able to piece together parts of this story. The date of marriage that Ed's parents had celebrated, which was about 9 months before his birth in 1937, was actually not the day that they got married. They actually only married 3 months before his birth. And my mother told me her mother once said that when Ed's parents married, she was pregnant by another man. But obviously, this information had never been told to Ed. Ed remarked to me, "Well, I guess you learn surprises even at 77. So now at this point, our goal changed. Ed could not provide us the Horton DNA since he was not biologically a Horton. However, upon learning this revelation, he was curious who his biological father actually was, which became our new goal. We could not ask his parents since they had both passed away several years ago. To find relatives of Ed's biological father, we compared people on 23andMe who were related to Ed but not related to his now half-brother Vernon. We uploaded his DNA onto Gedmatch and also made contact with people who had tested with Ancestry, which also prompted Ed to take a test with them. We were able to locate close paternal relatives that were related on paper to each other, and this allowed us to sort of greatly narrow down what family his biological father belonged to. He had paternal match with someone named Catherine from 23andMe, who was a second cousin once removed to a match from Gedmatch to a person named Mike who had tested with Ancestry. Mike and Catherine both descended from James and Cecilia Brown of Wichita, Kansas, which is about 90 miles from where Ed's mother lived in 1936. James and Cecilia had 6 surviving children and several grandsons near the same age as Ed's mother. Based on the amount of DNA shared with these people, I thought the most likely scenario was that Ed's father was one of these grandsons, but not through these children, Victor and Lulu, that are shown here above. So this theory that I was working with narrowed it down to 7 men alive in 1936, and they had the surnames Howell, Brown, McKiernan, and Wellman. All of these men were Wichita natives, but only the 2 Wellman brothers were still living in Kansas in 1936. My hope here was that with the family TreeDNA Y test that Ed had also taken, that he might get a surname match to one of these. These would not necessarily be descendants of these men here, but they would be patrilineal relatives to this man. Having this Y-DNA test as an additional tool was only possible because this involved the paternity of a male. This would not be possible if Ed had been a female. Ed's DNA results from mtDNA came back, and he matched 2 men named Wellman. So I felt reasonably confident we had narrowed it down to 2 men. These were 2 Wellmans and who had this brown DNA that Ed had matched several descendants. Now we try to determine which brother, Robert or Alfred, who were both deceased. Alfred had been married twice with no biological children by either wife. He was married at the time of Ed's conception. Robert was single when Ed was conceived, but later married and had 4 children. I contacted one of Robert's daughters, Marilyn. These 4 children were either going to be Ed's half-siblings or first cousins. Now, this raises ethical issues when approaching people, so I'm always careful to indicate exactly what we are trying to accomplish. Marilyn agreed to take a test, but then indicated she had recently taken a test with Ancestry. And as I mentioned, Ed had also decided to take an Ancestry DNA test in the midst of all of this. We compared Ed and Marilyn's DNA on Ancestry, and they were predicted to be first cousins. This made it fairly clear that Marilyn's uncle Al was Ed's biological father. So ultimately, this chart is to demonstrate how we determined Ed's biological father was Alfred Wellman. All the Brown DNA descendants had considerable DNA in common with Ed, and he had the Wellman Y DNA and was predicted to be a first cousin to Alfred's niece. Amazingly, everyone from his biological father's family had all taken DNA tests on their own only within the last month to 2 years. And so in this case, we did not even need to solicit anyone to take a test since all the necessary people had done so. Since this discovery, Ed's gotten to know his 4 biological cousins. They have all remarked on the similarity in physical appearance. Different people are going to react to this news in different ways. One of the reasons I'm able to share this story today is because in this case, no one took the news badly and everyone was pleased with how the research went. Ed told me that he always considered his father of record his father and felt treated as his real son. No One's Alive from 1936 to reveal the details of this romance between my Aunt Clara and this married body shop owner, Al Wellman. But in the course of this research, I've gotten to know a lot of Al's extended family, and we have sort of become cousins of sorts through our shared connection to Ed. Theirs is now biological, and ours is familial. Obviously, Ed's still a Horton and a member of our family, but he, as a genealogist, told me after he fully digested this information, I now have a lot more information to enter into my tree. Only 4 months elapsed between Ed taking his first DNA test and learning his biological father. While that's probably not typical, I think it's promising for someone who might think an unknown paternity is impossible, and certainly promising in situations of adoption. It's important to note that this wasn't just one test with one company. 11 autosomal tests were done between both 23andMe and Ancestry, and 3 Y-DNA tests were done with family TreeDNA. Of these, at least 6 people were truly needed to reach the conclusions that we made. I'll go over a few other pages and blogs that can be really useful for additional information. The first page is the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, ISOG, that I had mentioned. They have tons of useful information, tables, and other data that discuss much more detail about DNA tests and what you can expect from them. The next is Blaine Bettinger's blog, The Genetic Genealogist, which goes into a lot of detail on many DNA topics. And he's written this very helpful book shown above on DNA testing and genetic genealogy. One of the items that he has done is the Shared CM project, where he has solicited us to tell him the range of how much DNA in common we have with known relatives, which makes it highly useful to see if your relatives fall within the range of predicted kinships. And Judy Russell's blog, The Legal Genealogist, goes into topics beyond DNA, but does discuss DNA with some frequency, as well as opinions on the major testing companies, and as well as tests not to bother with. And NEHGS also will offer a variety of services to assist you with DNA testing in your family history research. We have a Genetics and Genealogy column in American Ancestors magazine, which I edit. We host several educational programs each year on DNA like this one, and we publish informative publications that can help you apply genetic testing to your genealogy. We also have just started to offer DNA consultations to help you choose the right test for you and your research goals, helping in interpreting your results and providing next step solutions. These consultations can be done in person, over the phone, or online. And you can learn about these services and more at americanancestors.org/DNA. Check back regularly as we continue to add new services and features. So with this webinar, I decided to do something a little different and trying to poll everyone here to see sort of how this information was taken in. So what I decided to do here is 2 hypothetical scenarios, and just to get your reactions about what you think might be the most useful DNA test or non-test to take. So here I have question 1. Mike does not know the identity of his father. Which test should he take to determine possible paternal genetic relatives? The possibilities are mtDNA and autosomal, Y-DNA and autosomal, only autosomal, or no DNA test would help. So if you can all give your response now, it's to see what type of test Mike should take to determine possible genetic relatives. Of all of these tests that are offered, what do you think the best tests might be? All right, and we have our answers, and 1% say mtDNA and autosomal, 98% say Y-DNA and autosomal, 1% only autosomal, and 0 say no DNA tests. 98% of you are correct. That is the right answer. Y-DNA, like the case of my mother's cousin Ed, is helpful when in solving the paternity of a male, and autosomal can be very helpful for finding close relatives to figure out exactly what family his dad belonged to. Well done. And then the next hypothetical scenario is Alice Tompkins has traced her patrilineal ancestry 8 generations back to Michael Tompkins from Ireland. She thinks Michael's wife was a Native American. What DNA test should she take to confirm this theory? So for this, our possibilities are, should she take an autosomal test? Should she take a Y-DNA test? Should she take a mitochondrial DNA test? Or will no DNA test help? And I know, yeah. So if we could, what test do you think Alice should take to prove her patrilineal ancestor, Michael Tompkins' wife, might have been Native American? Okay, so we get a little different answers here. So we have 44% who thinks autosomal DNA testing will help, 3% Y-DNA, 30% mitochondrial DNA, and 23% no DNA test will help. The true answer to say in terms of as a genealogist is the last answer, that no DNA test would help in really confirming this specific theory. Since 8 generations have gone between Alice and this possible Native American ancestor, and this is from a female going through all men down to Alice, this is not a gender-linked pattern of inheritance. It is possible that Alice could have trace amounts of Native American DNA at that many generations, but because there's so many ancestors that you do have at that level, it's really difficult to say that those would be ancestors from that ancestor versus all the hundreds of other ancestors that Alice does have. Something she could do, though, would be to trace a matrilineal descendant of that possible Native American ancestor, which would be her very distant cousin, but tracing her daughters of daughters of daughters down to the present day. But for Alice herself, there wouldn't be a DNA test that would really help in this particular situation.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. That was great. So now let's pause here and tackle any questions that you may have. I know that we don't have too much time and that there are a lot of questions waiting, so we won't be able to get to all of them. But go ahead and type your question into the panel, and Chris will answer as many as he can. So we have one question from John, who asks, so when you have a genetic match, how do you go about determining the shared ancestor?
So, I mean, you'll get the range of how you could be related. This, depending on the company you use from, you want to sort of identify relatives through this or that branch that you know how you're related. So this involves, looking at their trees. This gets a little more difficult between 4th and 5th and 6th cousins or so. But I mean, basically, you'd compare your trees and find the common ancestor, and unless you have a lot of endogamous ancestry, meaning cousins who married cousins or extremely similar ancestry, if it's a close match, you should be able to identify the shared ancestor.
Okay, and Lois asked, is there any limit to how many DNA tests you can upload to Gedmatch.com?
There is not. I believe I have about 25 uploaded myself, so you can upload as many as you want. You don't have to necessarily do it with the same account. I know people have alias emails that they use, like Gedmatch Kit 1, Gedmatch Kit 2, to sort of separate the flow, but I have them all with the same account, and I think it's easier that way.
Okay, and just for clarification, so Hazel says, my understanding is that you can't determine whether a match using an autosomal test is the mother's or father's line. So how did you go about making that determination with Ed, with the case study that you shared?
in this case, because we had his half brother who shared the same mother, I was paying attention to people who matched Ed but did not match Vernon, his brother, because we didn't have his mother alive to compare, but we had a half sibling. So essentially, we were looking at his results by process of elimination. So I just only looked at the results that were specific to Ed and not to Vernon. If we didn't have his younger brother, we would not have been able to determine paternal or maternal results. So even if you don't have, if your parents are deceased, you can do options if you get other members of your family to participate on certain sides.
All right, and we have a few questions about privacy. Can you maybe comment on privacy issues for those participating in these tests? Could the DNA samples or the results be shared with maybe law enforcement officials or even health insurance companies in the future?
I can't say for absolute certainty that that would never happen. I would think my general impression of taking DNA is that the likelihood that this could really impact your life with either health insurance or law enforcement is very limited. There was the one particular case in Idaho involving a homicide where police did look at the Sorensen Molecular Genealogical Foundation's database and then got an address from Ancestry. The person was cleared in that case. It wasn't even actually, I think, the best use of DNA. One of the reasons probably also law enforcement would be less inclined to use DNA would be sort of chain of custody. It's a lot easier for law enforcement to get your DNA when you throw a cup of coffee in the trash or something like that, and they can clearly say they saw you do it versus someone who sent in a kit. There's no videotape of that to confirm that this or that is the case. So, I mean, you can make your tree public, you can make your tree private. You should always consider there's some possibilities that you may learn things that you might not have wanted to know. But in terms of health insurance and law enforcement, it's possible, but I would not lose too much sleep over it.
Good to know. Thanks. And we also have a few questions about extracting DNA from hair, especially in the case where, a relative is deceased or unable to give kind of a saliva sample. Do these companies that you went over today, can they extract DNA from hair? Are there other companies out there that can? So if you could comment on that, that would be great.
Sure, and none of these companies that I've mentioned today really do DNA analysis from hair or bones or anything like that, but that was the very first, a lot of the first times where people did get DNA was that way. If you did have a lock of hair with the root or things like that, that usually will require sending DNA to a very specialized lab, and that's a costlier test, and the expectation that DNA will survive often depends on the environment that the DNA was stored. I do have an example of someone who's a member here that was able to successfully get saliva extracted from a stamp that had been licked 20 years ago, but that was not from one of these companies. The only of these companies, the only one that will sort of help with a very, very recently deceased individual is Family TreeDNA. If you are in the case where someone has died right away, you can contact Family TreeDNA by phone. They will rush a kit to you, and you could still do a cheek swab at a funeral home of a recently deceased relative. So that is something that's possible, but only in the immediate death of someone. For much older DNA relics, you would need a more specialized lab.
All right, and we also have a few questions about who's kind of taking these DNA tests as far as, is it, say, Ancestry DNA, are those only available to people in the US? Are people from other countries participating? Can you just maybe talk a little bit about the demographics of the pool, the pool of participants?
I mean, people are participating in all these countries in all these companies from several countries. The three that I mainly discussed today are US-based companies, so that is their target market. But I do know that people from Europe, elsewhere, Asia and Africa have participated in them. It's going to be a lot smaller pools from these other countries. MyHeritage DNA, for example, is a company based out of Israel, so they may have a market towards other international areas. And the other ones that I had sort of just briefly touched on, Oxford Ancestors, which is not autosomal, it's only Y and mtDNA. I mean, they are definitely catering towards a UK market, and WeGenes in China and East Asia. So that's something to look at. I don't know all the countries offhand, but you can, try to, if you are interested in matches from a specific country, you could try to learn some data about, which of these companies might have the best likelihood for matches.
All right, maybe just one more question since we're just about out of time. So we also have a few questions about soliciting DNA from other relatives, from maybe brothers who don't really want to get involved. Do you have any tips for either encountering someone that you don't know, that you're kind of genealogically sure that they would be that their DNA would be beneficial to your study, or maybe even convincing a relative to provide a sample?
Sure, and that's something I'm frequently tasked to do, getting DNA from strangers. Most of the time, I do a lot of research about a particular person who might be involved, and I will often contact them with them on their phone, and I'm very open and honest. I try to answer any potential question they have, and I tell them exactly why we want this DNA study. I probably have had about 70-75% success rate in getting DNA for these specific genealogical studies. Most of the time, it's not my own genealogy that I'm doing. It's something that we were tasked to do, and I'm essentially just a go-between because I'm able to explain the genealogy and the genetics. But you will get people who are not interested, and always you should also explain the other potential things that might happen, especially in these autosomal tests. This person might be needed for one specific reason, but they could learn other recent things about themselves. So you do want to be upfront with other scenarios that could be at play that you might reduce some of the people who might want to participate that way, but I think it's good to get open honesty. In your own family, and if they don't want to participate, I mean, sort of one of the things I've done with family members is I show them all the reports that I've gotten from these companies, and if I do, need them to take the DNA, I could entice them that way. But again, it is really everyone's personal decision. The examples I did mention with mtDNA being allowed to get DNA from a deceased individual is if someone, was deceased and you have that person's power of attorney, you could potentially decide to do that, after a person's death. That's, your own personal and moral choice. But I mean, you can't force anyone to do a DNA test. So I try to give the most positive reasoning, but still explain all the other situations at play.
All right, so unfortunately that's all the time that we have for today, but thank you again, Chris, for your presentation. Thank you everyone for participating and sending in your questions. I know that there were a lot of very specific questions to your own family history research, so you may consider scheduling one of those DNA consultations with one of our experts. If interested, you can write to consultations@nehgs.org, or you can also go to that website that Chris mentioned, americanancestors.org/DNA. And I will be sending those links and more information in my follow-up email to you later today. So thank you again. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. And I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.